Coming up on this episode, we're talking with Julie Dumalet from the Office of Pro-Life Activities to get an update about what's been going on since the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade and what we're doing in Galveston-Houston to respond. Welcome to Around the Archdiocese.
Sharing information, insights, and stories about our Catholic faith from across the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston, you're listening to Around the Archdiocese. Here's your host, Sean O'Driscoll.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Around the Archdiocese. Almost 2 years ago, with their ruling in the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and officially overturning the constitutional right for an abortion in the United States. Since then, the decision of how abortions are handled has been relegated to each individual state, which means the fight to protect life goes on. Today, we're going to get an update about what's been happening in the news and what's happening here in Galveston-Houston. My guest today is Julie Dumalet, Director of the Office of Pro-Life Activities for the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston. Because we are dealing with issues in this episode such as abortion, miscarriage, and in vitro fertilization, we know that these can be sensitive topics for some of our listeners. If you'd like assistance or are looking for help, you can call the Office of Pro-Life Activities at 713-741-8728, and we'll put that number and a link to their website in the show notes for this episode. So, without further ado, let's start the show. So, Julie, recently we heard one of the two major candidates for the office of the presidency coming up in this year's election said that the issue of abortion should be decided by the states.
Yes.
And this has been the situation post-Dobbs.
Correct.
When Roe versus Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court.
Right.
So while in one sense we kind of did win the fight on the national level, now it really is a state-by-state battle to help define the future of abortion access in the United States.
Sure. And essentially what the court did was it did give that issue back to the states. So we know that some states have greatly expanded the so-called right to abortion, right, since the Dobbs case. And then other states, such as Texas, there's essentially a complete outlawing of the practice. Right. And so in Texas, Texas had what was known as a trigger ban, which has nothing to do with gun control, I like to tell people. But essentially what that meant was when and if the Supreme Court overturned or limited Roe v. Wade, automatically state law in Texas would follow that to the extent possible. And so because the overturning of Roe did allow Texas to outlaw abortion. That's what we had pretty quickly following the Dobbs decision. So abortion is legal in Texas in the limited situation where the mother's life is deemed to be in danger or where she will suffer severe injury to a major bodily function unless she has the procedure. And I think there's been roughly 70 cases of legal abortion in Texas for those reasons since the Dobbs decision.
And from my understanding, there's still some arguing back and forth about where that line is, that it is kind of left up to the physician to decide what those cases are.
So there has been some controversy, and let me go back on that. There has been some confusion, some controversy. Physicians concerned: will I be sued if I perform an abortion in this case, or if I perform an induction in this case, a preterm induction, let's say, because a mom has a significant complication. These didn't tend to be things that were controversial or caused confusion pre-Dobbs, but now they seem to be in a few rare cases. We would love to see Texas do something similar to what South Dakota just did, which was have the government put out kind of a primer for doctors to say, these are the cases, these are the kinds of medical complications when abortion would be acceptable pursuant to South Dakota law. These are the cases that it would not, right? But this has been a concern, but I think it tends to get overblown in the media. What is the extent to which it is a concern, right? For example, the cases that we've tended to see in the media have involved not necessarily a threat to the mother's life or health, but a case where there was a significant adverse diagnosis for the fetus, which would mean unlikely that the fetus or the baby would survive long term. Right. And so those have tended to be the cases that have made it into the media.
Now, just to be clear, what is our Catholic response in these situations? Just because something's allowed by law doesn't mean that it falls in line with our Catholic morality.
Sure. So in the case where a mother's life is in danger, let's take that. And these might be cases where there was an ectopic pregnancy, let's say, or where, for example, a mother had untreatable preeclampsia. The Catholic Church employs an analysis called double effect, right? Which we tend to employ this in a medical situation where there is a medical procedure that's needed, but it may have an unintentional bad effect. So, for example, treatment for preeclampsia is delivery of the child, always. So we're delivering a child, not necessarily to harm the child, but to treat the mother's potentially fatal condition, right?
So the intent is not to kill the child. The intent is to save the mother, and this is an unintentional byproduct of the action.
Correct. Now, so when we deliver the child, let's say the child is preterm or almost at term, we deliver knowing the child may or may not survive, but our intention is not to end the life of the child. Our intention is to save the mother. And what we're doing is not a direct attack on the life of a child, because birth is a natural process. Now, that's very different, right, from if we were to say, we're going to go in and perform a D&E, dilation and evacuation, which is a late-term abortion procedure on that child. That is a direct attack on the child. There's not any way of performing that doesn't lead to the child's death intentionally, right? So you could say same result, but it really matters how we get there, right? And so a case like that, the church would say, yes, it leads to the demise of the child, or there's a good chance that it's going to lead to the demise of the child when we induce labor early, let's say. But that would be morally acceptable because we're not intentionally ending the life of that child. And induction of labor was a procedure that we used while Roe v. Wade was in effect. It's a procedure that we still use now that Dobbs is in effect.
Now, just because it's a state-by-state situation doesn't mean that there still aren't cases being brought up to the national level, which will affect all the states. I know we most recently heard about the case involving the chemical abortion pills that originally came out of Texas, right?
Right. So this case was brought in Texas by a group called the Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine. And many members of these groups work in emergency room settings and things of that nature. And so the argument that these physicians brought against the Food and Drug Administration and against the manufacturer of the chemical abortion pills, which is a company called Danco Labs, essentially the argument was that when the FDA expanded the use of these drugs in 2016 and again in 2021, that the FDA didn't follow their own procedures for opening up these expansions, and that this was going to unnecessarily put patients at risk, specifically through bleeding disorders or lack of follow-up or lack of physical exam prior to administering the drugs.
So the case was brought all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Correct.
Arguments were just made just recently.
Yes.
What was the outcome of that? I don't think the Supreme Court has made a decision yet.
You're right. So they have not made a decision. They likely will do so this summer, probably the end of June. So remember what happened in 2022 with Dobbs. It was the very end of the term. This will probably be something similar. What appeared to those that listened to the oral arguments was that the Supreme Court was concerned with this issue of standing, right? And what that means in layman's terms is you can't bring a lawsuit as a concerned citizen, right? So you need to have some sort of injury that you're alleging, or some way that you personally have been affected by a law, or that it's almost certain that you will be affected negatively, right, by a given law. So just a silly example that we could give, let's say that a tax is put on beef products, right? Well, I'm a vegetarian, but I don't like that beef eaters are having to pay more for their hamburger, so I'm going to find a legal basis to bring suit. Well, I don't have standing, right, because I don't eat beef. I'm not injured by the fact that there's a tax on beef. Okay. Same kind of thing here. The Supreme Court was really seemed skeptical of the fact that these doctors who work in emergency rooms had suffered a particular type of injury, or that they were going to suffer a particular type of injury from having to care for patients that had complications from using these drugs. Now, let's say that a woman who was injured by the use of these drugs wanted to bring suit. She would be much more likely to have standing. What the doctors claimed was that we are having to, patients are coming in with complications from taking these chemical abortion drugs, and there is a possibility that we are going to have to complete an abortion that has begun, and that violates our conscience rights. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like they were able to indicate that they had ever up to this point had to do that, or that it was likely they were going to have to complete an abortion sufficient for the court to say, yes, you have been injured by the way the FDA made these approvals.
And this is based upon the line of questioning that the justices used to the lawyers making the argument. Correct.
And it really looked like both your conservative and your liberal justices were all of them expressing concern that the standing issue had not been met.
So to understand, when the court does come out with a decision, later this summer, they could rule on the issue itself, right, of the chemical abortion pills. But based on the line of questioning, it's more likely at this point, it seems, that they'll make a ruling based on whether these litigants were actually able to bring the suit in the first place.
I think that's right. I think the conventional wisdom right now is that, yes, the Supreme Court will punt, if you will, on the underlying issues of, did the FDA follow their own procedures? Did they do anything wrong in approving these drugs? Or was that a good decision to do? And essentially leave their decision on, these plaintiffs didn't have standing, therefore the case is either dismissed or referred back to the lower court, without reaching the larger decision of, what about these chemical abortion drugs?
So just to be clear, someone in the future could bring the same case back up through the court system again in the future.
Potentially, yes. If someone was able to show that they were specifically harmed by these drugs and by the way that the FDA made their new approvals.
So we're talking about chemical abortion pills. As Catholics, that still falls under the umbrella of abortions.
Oh, absolutely.
So the same morality applies regardless of the method through which the abortion is.
Right. So morally, there's no difference between a surgical abortion and a chemical abortion. Same thing. It's just that our procedure is different.
So why are the chemical abortion pills such an issue right now? How is that different? in terms of access or side effects?
Sure. So let's first of all just talk about how do they work, right? Because a lot of people don't know. So this is generally a 2-pill regimen that a woman will be given. What happens is a woman will take the first pill. What that medication does is it interferes with the connection of the fetus to the uterine wall. Well, that's how the fetus gets its nourishment. So if that connection is destroyed, the fetus has no nourishment, will die pretty quickly. The second pill, which is taken about 24 hours later, causes the uterine contractions that will cause the uterus to flush out the contents, blood, fetal tissue. And so an abortion will usually occur at home, in a bathroom, in a bedroom, in a dorm room, right? This is different from what we traditionally have thought of abortion, where someone goes to a clinic, they have a surgical procedure that can take various different forms depending on gestational age of the baby. With the chemical abortion, prior to 2016, the FDA had said this can be used up to 7 weeks or 49 days gestation, right? In 2016, the FDA said, well, we're going to expand that use to 10 weeks or 70 days. And there's concern because the greater the gestational age, the larger that fetus is going to be, the more tissue there's going to be that needs to be passed, and the more likelihood of complications when we're inducing bleeding, and that bleeding is happening at home, right? So that was what happened in 2016. In 2021, we'll remember we were in the midst of the pandemic, and the FDA said, because it's so difficult for people to get to their doctor and have a face-to-face with their doctor, it's okay if these pills are prescribed without a physical examination, right? And so one of the things that everybody agrees are very dangerous and actually contraindicated is if you have an ectopic pregnancy, the way to resolve it is not through a chemical abortion. Even if you're wanting to have an abortion, that's going to be very dangerous potentially. You also have to keep the use of these pills within that 10-week time frame. Well, if we're not having a physical examination, how are we for sure going to diagnose an ectopic pregnancy and be sure that we're not giving those pills to someone that's having that medical complication? How can we be sure that someone who thinks they're 8 weeks pregnant is not really 12 weeks pregnant, right? So we really need a physical exam. So the argument goes to diagnose those conditions. And the FDA said in 2021, we really don't need that. So over and above the fact that this is an abortion, which is a moral evil from the perspective of the Catholic Church, there's also a concern that this is also a procedure that's putting a lot more women's health at significant risk. And I think the FDA's their own literature will say there's about a 4% chance that a woman who ingests the abortion pills is going to need emergency treatment of some kind, right? Which sounds pretty high.
Well, and as you said, there's no oversight during it. They're
Correct.
given the pills and then they go home and are kind of left to their own devices.
Correct.
For a procedure that I mean, as horrific as it is to begin with, just morally, but to go through such, it's not just inducing a miscarriage. With the 2 pills, you're actually killing the child first.
Correct.
And then inducing the body to flush everything out.
To expel the fetus, yes.
Yeah, and just the amount of violence involved with that.
Right.
To tell a woman, here's the pills, good luck, call me if you need anything.
Good luck. And unfortunately, most medical providers of these drugs will recommend come back in 2 weeks. Let's make sure that everything's going well. But the reality is most women won't, or a good number of women won't, because this is such a traumatic thing that's just happened. There's a desire to put it away, lock it away in a box and be done with it. So women often don't follow up for an abortion after an abortion procedure. And of course, anybody that's had a miscarriage will know you have the miscarriage and your doctor will ask you to come back in. Let's make sure that all of the tissue has been removed from the uterus, because if it's not, that can lead to sepsis and various other complications. But many women are not getting that follow-up care just because of the nature of the abortion that's very, very traumatic. And what we see, I was in a USCCB Project Rachel conference, and Project Rachel, for those that don't know, is the church's ministry to women and men who have experienced an abortion and are suffering and seeking healing. And what they were talking about is because this miscarriage, this abortion is happening in the home. Unfortunately, there are psychological associations of the home that should be a place of sanctuary and safety with that abortion experience. So walking into the bathroom where the abortion occurred can be triggering, or the bedroom, or the dorm room, or even the whole house can be triggering and kind of a cloud over the entire home can be spread. We have seen, to talk about women who have experienced chemical abortion versus a surgical abortion. The surgical abortion, as horrific as it is, and it is horrific when you hear people describe what's happened, there's often a lag time between the abortion itself and when people will come for healing, right? What we find with the chemical abortion procedure is, because it's so visceral, because the mother will often come face to face with the remains of the child during the procedure, women tend to reach out much sooner, oftentimes within weeks after the abortion, to seek help and to seek healing. It is not infrequent at all for women to say, I'm experiencing suicidal feelings. Is that common after this experience? And we have to say, yeah, unfortunately, it really can be. That's not to say there isn't excellent help out there for healing, but as with any trauma, that healing is going to be a process, right? So this is something that person is going to have to live with. We can't take it away, but we can work with them on their healing.
Now, you mentioned the time frame. Is that something that is set on a national level? Are states able to override that time frame of when those are available?
From the drugs for the FDA?
Yeah.
No. So states are not able to override. It's a 10-week limit. I can't say that no one's ever used the drugs in a way that they were not intended to be used. I think our concern always is, if someone is obtaining the drugs through telemedicine, or has not had a physical exam and is just on the phone with a medical provider who's going to prescribe those drugs, the danger always is, just because a woman thinks she knows the gestational age of her child is no guarantee that she's correct, right? No guarantee there's not going to be some other complications. And so, in addition to the evil of the abortion, we may be setting women up for a potentially catastrophic medical complication, right?
And are these pills available in the state of Texas? Is this something someone here is able to obtain?
So they are not legal in the state of Texas, right? We know that there are online providers that will unfortunately provide those pills to women in the state of Texas. Our concern has always been, because Texas has outlawed telemedicine abortion even before Roe v. Wade was overturned. Telemedicine abortion was outlawed. But that doesn't mean there may not be an unscrupulous provider in another state who is saying, well, sure, I'll meet with you over Zoom, and then I'll prescribe those drugs and I'll mail them to you across state lines, right? And so then we really don't have any medical oversight. And we know, unfortunately, that women are often advised by organizations like Planned Parenthood, if you have to go to the emergency room following a chemical abortion, tell them you're having a miscarriage. It's none of their business that you've had an abortion. That's between you and your conscience, right? Well, unfortunately, your body's going to respond differently to a natural miscarriage in many cases than it will to an abortion-induced pregnancy loss, okay? So advising women, don't advise your doctor what's really going on, is absolutely terrible advice. I don't think I need to tell anybody that's terrible advice. But unfortunately, we do hear those things.
Now, we're also hearing about the situation in Alabama with IVF.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And that came up in the news recently. Can you tell us a little bit more about that situation?
So in this particular case, let me explain how the IVF procedure is done for those that may not know. So IVF, or in vitro fertilization, this is most often used by infertile couples who are seeking, the laudable goal, right, of becoming parents. So they will go to an IVF clinic. They will obtain the sperm from the man. They will harvest eggs from the woman, which is not in itself a benign procedure, right? This is all sorts of hormonal treatments are involved in this, but they will harvest eggs, usually about 11 to 12. From those eggs and that sperm, they will create 7 to 8 embryos. You might ask, well, what happens to the other eggs? Well, it's maybe determined that they're not of sufficient quality, so we're just going to discard those. So now we have 7 or 8 embryos on average. Well, from a Catholic perspective, that's a new human person.
Yeah, conception has taken place.
Conception has taken place, right? Life begins at conception. We know this. So at that point, they will attempt to achieve a pregnancy, right? So a couple will go through what's known as an IVF cycle, where they'll take 3 or 4 embryos, try to implant them, right? Oftentimes that won't take the first time. We won't have a pregnancy achieved the first time. So let's do it again. Let's do it again. Well, what happens to those extra embryos in between the cycles? Well, they're essentially placed in a freezer, right? And then when it's time for the next cycle, if we don't get the pregnancy that we were hoping for, we will unfreeze those embryos and we'll use them again.
Now, when they're unfrozen, are they all still viable?
Not necessarily. No. There is going to be loss of some number of them, up to 50% of those embryos, depending on, again, I'm sorry to say it this way, embryo quality, will not survive the unthawing process, right? So we take the ones that did survive the unthawing process and we try to, again, achieve a pregnancy through another IVF cycle.
So what I'm hearing is, first of all, we're combining the cells, we're creating life outside of the woman's body, outside of the act.
Correct.
And then knowing that it's a procedure where majority of these embryos are not going to survive.
Right.
I mean, I can understand why the church is so adamant against.
Is concerned about this, yeah.
And you said it's a laudable goal that so many couples, so many men and women want to be parents and are unable to do so.
Right.
And I think we hear this argument, okay, but the science is there. We can do it.
Right.
How do we have a conversation in that to help them understand that, yes, the goal is good, but how we get there matters?
Right. And that's kind of the nature of morality in our culture. Well, I had good intentions, so therefore what I'm doing must be good. I had a good goal, so I can get there any way that I can. And we know that from a perspective of Catholic moral theology, that's not how we do things. The way we get there matters. And I think, this is probably a good time to mention, the couples that are listening that either are struggling with infertility or the couples that maybe have gone through IVF cycles or are going through IVF cycles or have done it in the past and maybe have a child through IVF. This conversation is not about in any way shaming or taking to task or anything like that. It's about educating, because our goal always is, how do we treat other human beings in a manner consistent with their dignity, in a manner that respects their dignity as a child of God, right? And the fact is that the IVF process just simply doesn't do that. It does not respect the dignity of these young human people, right? I once talked with a young woman. She was in her 20s. She was going through the RCIA process. And the topic of Catholic moral teaching and IVF and contraception and all of these kind of hot button issues that we deal with came up. And in our small group discussion, she said, I'm never going to think IVF is a problem, because that's why I'm here. I'm a product of IVF. So I'm never going to be able to think that's wrong. And I think we can all be very sympathetic to that perspective, right? And certainly the church does not say that the people that come to be through IVF in any way have less dignity, or that we somehow don't want them here, or that the church is in any way saying that they shouldn't be here. What the church is saying is that the way that you came to be was not consistent with your human dignity. And certainly the fact that many of your siblings were lost in the process or are still in a state of suspended animation in a freezer, right, is not at all consistent with their human dignity.
And not to touch on, a difficult subject, but the church teaches the same thing about children who are the product of, say, rape or incest.
Correct.
That even though how they came to existence was wrong,
right,
that doesn't negate anything about their inherent dignity as a child of God.
Absolutely. No, that's very true.
So looking specifically now at the case in Alabama, what
right.
happened there?
Okay. Getting back to your original question. So what happened in that case, the suit was brought against the fertility clinic by several couples who had lost their embryos that they had saved for different IVF cycles. And what had happened was the clinic had not adequately secured the area where these embryos were frozen, essentially, and somebody from the hospital walked in, knocked over the container, and the containers broke. The embryos were not protected and died. So the couples came back and said, we want to bring a case, and specifically the case they brought was for the wrongful death of their children under Alabama law. Now, from a Catholic perspective, we would certainly say, yes, those were their children. Not in a very dignified state, right? But still children that deserve to be protected. So the Alabama Supreme Court ultimately agreed and said, yes, these embryos are children, and for the purposes of the Wrongful Death Act, these parents can recover damages for the deaths of their children. So you would think, well, that sounds very pro-life. That sounds very good.
It sounds like the court is recognizing that these embryos, these single or just few cell embryos, are in fact human beings and need to be treated as such under the law. That sounds like a major win
for the pro-life side, right? So why would this have caused so much controversy? Well, we talked earlier about the fact that the majority of the embryos that are created through IVF are not going to survive, going to die at some point in the process, either because we attempt to implant them and that doesn't take, and so they die in utero, or because they don't survive the unfreezing process, or because they're left in the frozen state indefinitely, right? And then maybe we get a baby out of that. But even for women that are relatively young, it's about a 50% chance that you will ultimately, through multiple IVF cycles, carry a pregnancy to term, right? For women that are over 35, which is many of the women that use IVF, the chances of carrying a pregnancy to term decrease pretty rapidly. So what we have here, we're losing many children in this process. So the clinics pretty quickly realized, well, the nature of what we're doing, we're going to have to lose any number of embryos to carry one to term. And so if we suddenly become liable for all of those losses, we're not going to be able to continue doing what we're doing, right? Because loss of embryos is just part of the nature of this business. So pretty quickly you had even your pro-life legislators coming out and saying, oh no, we have to protect IVF because IVF is creating pregnancy, and that's to the good. And I just want to, if I can, read, if we're familiar with the group Catholics for Choice, this is the group that they call themselves Catholic, but they don't agree with most of the life issues, with the church on most of the life issues. So what they said about this IVF issue is as follows. They said, the church takes motherhood very seriously, but the church also creates shame for the very people, those using IVF, who are trying to do what the church says it wants them to do, which is have children and create families, unquote. All right. So as we read that, I think we need to be very clear about what the church is asking couples to do. Anybody that's been through marriage prep knows that the language is used, are you going to be open to children? And you have to say yes for the church to agree to send you through the process. The church does not say, we want you to have as many children as you possibly can. That is not and has never been the church's goal there. We want you to be open to having children. And so what does that mean practically? Well, it's the difference between being open to God's plan for your life and for God's plan to bring new people into the world. And being willing to accept the children that God sends to you, and also to accept if having children is not part of God's plan for your marriage, which that is a huge burden for many couples. We know that. So we don't want to negate that or say that that's not important or a real trial. So it's the difference between being open to God's plan and saying, this is what I want, and I'm going to get what I want through whatever means I possibly can.
I used to work with a priest who, when speaking on this subject, would make the analogy, wanting to adopt a child to provide them a good family and a happy home is different from kidnapping a child because you think you can provide a better family and a better home. The intent is the same, but the means by which we go about it makes a difference. And this goes back to where we started this conversation about IVF.
Right. And I know that this really is a struggle for a lot of people, particularly those that are experiencing infertility, but even those that aren't, because most of us know somebody that struggled with infertility, that's thought about IVF, that's struggled with infertility and tried to come to terms with what the church is telling them and what it appears God's plan for their life is, which may in some circumstances be very contrary to their emotional inclinations, right? Because the desire for children is good and laudable, and we want to promote healthy families and happy families. So it is a struggle, but that's where that Alabama case, excuse me, has come down.
So a lot going on.
A lot going
in
on
the pro-life world.
Yes.
And there are many more issues that I wish we had more time to discuss today.
Right, for sure.
Real quick before we go, you brought up Project Rachel
Yes.
before, and I know that's something that we focus on here in the Archdiocese, that your office focuses on. How do we provide that post-abortive healing ministry? Can you tell me a little bit about that and what we do here in Galveston-Houston?
Absolutely. So the Project Rachel ministry, we have two teams. We have our wonderful Spanish team and our wonderful English team. And they've all been involved in this ministry for, at least a decade, most of our leaders, but in some cases more than that. And so we always want to, it's really a threefold healing approach. There's the spiritual, there's the psychological healing that needs to take place, the spiritual healing, the coming back into communion with the church, and with God, and feeling comfortable with one's relationship with our Lord. And then there's the physical healing that needs to take place, because abortion has represented a trauma to the body as well as to the soul and to the emotional, psychological aspect of the person. So practically what we offer is 2 retreats annually in each language, and these are weekend retreats. And these feature opportunities to share one's story. These feature opportunities to speak with others that are experiencing the same hurts and need of healing that you are. These opportunities for sacramental reconciliation, Eucharist, memorial rites for the lost children. We also have ongoing Bible studies. Usually these are 10-week courses in English and in Spanish. And we always have a mental health professional available at these retreats, because we know that that's the psychological healing that's needed. We want to have somebody present that's capable of dealing with any issues that may come up, as well as having clergy to assist with any of the spiritual needs that may come up. So those are the main programs, but we also have a network of wonderful clergy, wonderful spiritual directors, wonderful counselors that we will refer for the different needs that come up. At the conference I attended last week, we were talking about others, so grandparents that are in need of healing, maybe a grandparent that took their daughter to the abortion clinic, or insisted that was how the family was going to handle an unplanned pregnancy. Maybe a sibling. We at a recent retreat, we had a young girl who came with her mother, who had aborted a younger sibling. And they came to heal together, and it really was very beautiful. And so we not infrequently will have siblings come with their parents after an abortion. And so because what we find is this abortion experience can affect the entire family. And so that healing certainly can be done, but it's available to men, it's available to women, grandparents, friends, anybody that was involved in that decision. And it's been really beautiful. Most of us on that team, especially when we start the retreat on Friday night, everybody's very nervous to be there. It's sometimes people have, it's been decades and they haven't told anybody, or they've told us about their abortion experience when they called on the phone. And it's not infrequent to have somebody say, "You're the first person I've ever told about this," right? Which is a great privilege. To be trusted with that information, right? So we need to make sure that we're very careful with that person in that vulnerable state. But, they come, most of them will say, "I almost didn't come. I really felt like I wanted to call and cancel. And everyone's very nervous about, what am I going to be asked to do? Are people going to judge me? Am I going to be? So fast forward less than 48 hours later to the end of that retreat, where people have had their sacramental reconciliation. People have been able, often for the first time, to talk to other people with a similar experience, and to be welcomed back into the church. And the weight that's been lifted is almost tangible. You can feel it lift throughout the weekend, and to see the smiles and the laughter on people's faces, and the feeling that I can be forgiven. I can have a relationship with that child that's lost. That child isn't lost to me forever, and I have hope for my future going forward. Really can be a life-changing thing. So to be part of that, huge privilege. I think anybody that's on that team will tell you that. I think it's just wonderful. So we're very blessed to be able to offer that.
And I know on the website it says that the next round of retreats, both in English and Spanish, are coming up in August and September.
Correct.
So if people are interested, they can just contact your office?
Yes. So they should contact the pro-life office. There's only 2 people that will answer the phone there. It's either myself or my assistant, Zulema, and she helps to handle the Spanish calls. Because I'm unfortunately not bilingual, but yes, they can call the office, and we can let them know, and for those that might think, well, August is a really long time, that doesn't mean that we can't set them up with some of our healing ministries right now. Certainly we can. It's just for those larger events, those will take place August and September.
And we'll go ahead and make sure to include the phone number and a link to the web pages for Project Rachel and your office in the show notes for this episode.
Thank you. That would be wonderful.
Julie, for our listeners who want to offer up some sort of prayer or spiritual support, what should they be praying for right now? What are some of the issues or events, or what's coming up that we can really direct our prayers towards?
So let's pray for our Gabriel Project teams in particular. Many people don't know, but after Dobbs, we've seen over a 100% increase in the number of women seeking assistance, carrying to term. And there's a variety of reasons for that, right? But certainly the Dobbs case has had an impact on that. And so our teams are much busier than they've ever been. But it's a great kind of busy to have. And to be able to walk with and accompany these moms, spiritually support them, emotionally support them with material goods for their babies. So please pray for our teams as they're dealing with these much larger numbers, also as they're trying to fundraise, that our parishes and our teams will be generous. And so let's in particular keep them in prayer right now.
And if people would like to donate to that as well, they can find that information on the website, because it really is kind of a continuation that our love for these children of God, whether a single cell embryo,
right,
or just out of the womb, or months, years later, our care for them and for their families as a church continues.
Right. We care for the dignity of the human person throughout the life cycle. So from conception to natural death, as we like to say. And of course, in the pro-life office, we tend to be more focused on the conception and the beginning of life, because we have a wonderful Office of Aging that does a lot of work at the end of life, although we do work with that too. But yes, now after Dobbs, with our new laws in Texas, what we're increasingly needing to do is let's reframe our mission to really be supporting moms, dads, families. And there's lots of different ways that we can do that. So for anyone that would be interested in exploring some of those options, either for themselves or for their parish, please reach out to the Pro-Life Office. We would love to talk to you about any of those options. And
a big thank you to Julie for joining us for this episode. Again, If you're looking to help, or if you're in need of help, you can contact the Office of Pro-Life Activities for the Archdiocese by calling 713-741-8728, or you can find them online at archgh.org/prolife. We'll make sure we put that phone number and a link to that office in the show notes for this episode. And, as always, if you want to learn about any of the offices or ministries of the Archdiocese of Galveston-Houston, you can find us online at archgh.org. That's archgh.org. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again next time, here on Around the Archdiocese.